Good afternoon and welcome to today's Asia Society event, Disruptive Asia, Governance for Sustainable Development in Asia. My name is Krista Milne and I'm the Co-Director for Climate Change and City Resilience at the City of Melbourne. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that many participants today in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm currently on the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land, and I would like to acknowledge all traditional owners and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and First Nations people joining our webcast today. At the City of Melbourne, we are committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians. The City of Melbourne is delighted to be partnering with Asia Society to deliver today's event, bringing Asia Society's Disruptive Asia publication to life and exploring how we can govern, develop and growth and govern development and growth in Australia and the region sustainably, responsibly and with accountability. Good governance that is socially inclusive and environmentally focused will be vital for the region's sustainable recovery. The City of Melbourne plays an important role in building Melbourne's global competitiveness and providing opportunities for local and international businesses. We actively engage with Asia through our sister partner cities in China, Japan and Indonesia, and are also members of the Business Partner Cities Network. We encourage and facilitate knowledge sharing and collaboration among businesses, universities, research institutes and other government stakeholders. On the sustainability front, City of Melbourne is currently working in partnership with the University of Melbourne to embed the Sustainable Development Goals in our planning and reporting framework. Through that process, we will localise the Sustainable Development Goals for the Melbourne context and use them to prioritise, benchmark the way the city is addressing our global challenges such as poverty, climate change, clean energy, sustainable buildings, economic development and water use and many other issues. The project will also highlight best practice ways where major cities are leveraging the Sustainable Development Goals such as New York, Barcelona and Los Angeles. And Melbourne will also be linked with other cities across the Asia-Pacific region, which are also using the goals. The goals will help guide our thinking when we invest in services such as recycling, renewable energy, open spaces, homelessness, affordable housing, cycling lanes, water conservation and planting trees, and will ultimately benefit our city. There's also work underway to assist local and regional governments external to the City of Melbourne to engage with their own subnational reviews on using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are proving useful for cities and regions to foster sustainable local development goals, localisation and demonstrate government's capability and capacity and commitments. And finally, later this week, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific will launch the Asia Pacific Regional Guidelines on Voluntary Local Reviews. The Asia Pacific Regional Guidelines aim to support Asian and Pacific cities willing to undertake voluntary local reviews and produce an initial report to stakeholders on how cities can work to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. City of Melbourne is finding the voluntary local review process highly valuable to benchmark ourselves and work out where to focus our effort. So on to today's event. It will run for about 45 minutes with 25 minutes for our panel discussion and 15 minutes for questions. So please do submit your questions via the YouTube live chat box. It's now my pleasure to introduce our expert panel for today. Further background on the incredible expertise our speakers have is in the link we are sharing with you now in the chat box. From Sydney, we are joined by Meriden Varel, Director at the Australia Geopolitics Hub at KPMG Australia, And Meriden comes with years of experience working in Asia and sustainability spaces as former director of the East Asia program at the Lowy Institute and assistant country director and senior policy advisor for the UNDP China. Joining us from Melbourne, we have Arjuna Diblee, fellow at Stanford University's Steyer Taylor Centre for Energy Policy and Finance. Arjuna's work is at the intersection of law, economics, and public policy and focuses on climate, energy, and innovation. And finally, joining us all the way from Bangkok, which is one of the great values of this world we find ourselves in now, we have Mazahul Alam, the Regional Coordinator for Climate Change Program at the UN Environment. A career at the UN spanning decades, Mazahul oversees the implementation of climate change program at the UN Environment in Asia and Pacific region, ensuring it aligns with outcomes of the UN Environment Assembly, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll now hand over to Asia Society's Executive Director and Curator of the Disruptive Asia Sustainability Series, Thomas Som, to moderate the conversation. Very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Krista. Great to have you with us today, and also like to thank the City of Melbourne for partnering with us on today's event. It's really great to have you as one of our members and partners, and I think it's a very fitting collaboration, noting some of the work you do on sustainability and community resilience. And of course, thank you also for making the time today. Extremely hectic schedule for you all in Victoria, and congratulations on the latest numbers, getting COVID down to 0 new cases. So it's a great day for Melbourne. So thank you again for being with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge all traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now let's get to the discussion. Very excited to have Mutsaharul, Meriden, and Arjuna with us today. Very good to see you, and a very warm welcome. Mutsaharul, I'll start with you and some initial reflections. We discussed prior on the impact of COVID and on the 2030 agenda. Obviously, despite significant impact the pandemic has had on human life, our societies and economies, some consider the pandemic actually to be good news for the environment. Carbon emissions are dropping dramatically. We've seen reductions in air pollution as a result of less travel and movement of people. And aside from, horrific human loss, is COVID actually a crisis that can help sustainability? Or is it still more likely to slow down our progress? Or to put it in this way, to what extent do you think success with the SDGs is tied to success dealing with the pandemic?
Thank you, Thomas, for invitation. Let me start with the point you have just mentioned about the COVID and horrific human impacts and suffering. First of all, I'd like to convey our condolences to the families who have lost their loved ones. We also stand in solidarity with the millions of healthcare professionals for their tireless effort for keeping us safe and working around the clock to tackle this global pandemic. You have mentioned a couple of benefits, and those benefits are primarily arises due to the several restrictions imposed by the countries. Therefore, the COVID-19 does not provide a silver lining for the environment. The positive environmental outcomes that we are seeing right now are temporary in our view. And without the fundamental shift in the global, particularly the energy production and the way we are consuming the resources, we have no reason to expect this temporary reduction would translate into a sustained long-term trend. Now, in the context of the SDG in the Asia-Pacific region, We all know that 2020 is the start of the decade for action for the sustainable development. And this 2020, we are also facing this pandemic. Now, the latest report that we have produced by the UNESCAP on the progress of SDG, the Asia Pacific region as a whole is not on track to achieve any of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Therefore, this region needs to accelerate its progress in all SDGs. And particularly, I'd like to mention the SDG 12 and the SDG 13, which are related to the consumption and the production, as well as the climate change. That is the area I'm working on. Our most worrying part, as they're actually going backwards and needs to reverse the trend so that we see the progress in terms of achieving the SDG goal, the 12 and the 13. I'd like to mention also the two important elements in terms of showing the progress in the region. One is if we look into the different indicators, we only have a bit more than the 40% indicators are available for assessing the progress. So it is not easy also to show the progress in all SDGs. But also another point to remind ourselves that if we look into the progress, it is not the linear. So maybe we'll be seeing more progress in this upcoming the decade. Now you have mentioned about this the COVID, which is obviously putting impacts because the immediate priorities of the government is to address the immediate needs, particularly the saving the human lives, supporting them for their food and etc. And we are not yet seeing the recovery package, which some countries are putting the recovery package. But from our side, the business as usual recovery package will not actually bring the changes. Rather, it implies the temperature increase over 3 degrees centigrade. And it also implies the great future uncertainty, instability, as well as the climate damages. So without decisive the government intervention, emission will rebound once the lockdown ends. One of the points that I'd like to mention is the opportunity to rethink, and this is related to the subsidy that the governments are providing for the fossil fuel. And this COVID is actually, this is one of the area providing us the indication that we can rethink about the subsidy that we are providing to the fossil fuel, particularly the subsidy going to the coal. And many of you are aware, the Secretary General, the urge to the countries for no new investment in coal. And in terms of that subsidy, the China is probably the top country providing the subsidy to the fossil fuel as well as the coal. Other countries in the region, this is India. So we need to think about reshaping the subsidy in the energy sector. Let me stop here. Thank you, Thomas, again.
Thanks very much. There's a lot to unpack there, and we'll come back to a couple of those points later on. I wanted to bring in Meriden now, and it kind of builds on some of the comments Mutsahar just made, particularly around, government intervention and the role of businesses in this as well to help, I guess, around our recovery efforts. And as noted, we had the former Australian Ambassador for the Environment, Patrick Suckling, now with the Asia Society Policy Institute, also commented on this, where he really called governments and corporates alike to kind of make sustainability, the center of our recovery efforts, but also how businesses consider their own future investments. How do you see it? How will sustainability, fare, and how will it be impacted as a region to tackling the pandemic? And how do we really balance, a really significant crisis that need immediate attention with more long-term solutions.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks also for the invitation to be part of this panel. Look, Patrick's not alone in his call to, this word must is appearing a lot in the analysis of effective recovery strategies. We get must and sustainability in the same sentence a lot, and we see that the United Nations talks about this, the World Bank talks about this, the OECD talks about this. It's a pretty sort of prevalent discourse, must sustainability. The OECD notes that more resilient economies depend on a shift to sustainable practices. So this is something that business and corporates are obviously very interested in. We need to, of course, remember that sustainability is not just one thing, it's a multifaceted thing, and sustainable growth and sustainable development are multifaceted concepts. And as the 17 SDGs really clearly show, they're inextricably interconnected. You can't develop sustainably over here without developing sustainably over there. You'll fall through the bottom. We've been really lucky in Australia overall in the way that we've experienced COVID. And it's sometimes easy to forget the enormous and very real impact COVID is having, as Mutsaharol just pointed out as well, on millions of people around the world, including our near neighbours. And so, of course, again, as Mutsaharol noted, governments around the world and in the region are really grappling with a very difficult challenge of how to get back on track. There's immediate things that need to be done. It's a daunting challenge. So how sustainability in its multifaceted way fits into those recovery efforts is a big challenge, and it's a very mixed picture. So for some examples on the upside, we have countries like Japan pledging to be carbon neutral by 2050, South Korea also, China, with the caveats that, again, Mutsaharol just mentioned in terms of coal subsidies, China has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060. There's not much detail about this yet, but it indicates that a lot of this post-COVID recovery in some countries in our region, that rebuilding and investment and stimulus is going to be focusing on environmentally sustainable areas. It's also perhaps worth considering how the growing middle class in Asia and around the world, and that middle class has taken a hit through COVID in terms of its economic development, as everyone else has. But given we're talking about a kind of K-shaped development, where K-shaped recovery, where the wealthy are likely to come out faster and stronger, and very unfortunately, the already existing vulnerable and marginalised will continue to be vulnerable and marginalised. But in terms of the middle class story, that is going to be a trajectory that continues, and they have a tendency to demand a certain quality of life. And this might also have some positive implications for sustainable development. We've seen this pattern in China, right? With the demand of the middle class for clean air, the complete intolerance now for that kind of polluted air, not being able to access clean water. It's become a question of political legitimacy to some degree in China, and that's shaped the government's agenda. So I think there's some potential that growing middle class and the demands of the growing middle class may also help aid the sustainability agenda. But despite these kind of upsides, and despite the very clear economic, not to mention social, case for sustainable recovery, what we have seen for the most part in most national stimulus and recovery packages so far scores very poorly on sustainability efforts and those metrics. We have to, of course, remember as well that it's not just a national issue. Sustainability and sustainable development is a cross-border issue. And at the moment, and for the foreseeable future, the geopolitical context we're operating in is a world where the political will for cross-border cooperation and cross-border solutions is in very short and in dwindling supply. So although I agree very heartily with Patrick, with the OECD and with many other analysts that we must balance the short term and the long term for social outcomes, but as also for economic and business outcomes, at this stage, we just aren't seeing that sufficiently to meet the challenges.
Thanks, Marion. And I will just stay on that last point a little bit and come to Arjuna, someone who follows, government policies, particularly climate change and energy policies in the region. How do you see our governments there, I guess, leveraging COVID as an opportunity to kind of reset some of the policy settings and maybe embrace sustainability more as a political goals, do you really see, they're governing, unique chance in a sense to govern through a crisis and really make a difference and have an impact and potentially change some of the policies that can really, move the country towards a more sustainable path? What's your observations there?
Yeah, well, thank you, Thomas. It's great to be here. I guess let me start by underscoring the importance of your question, because I think, particularly from a climate change perspective, I think it's a very important question, and we should think about the kind of broader context here of crisis and government responses. So, energy economists and policy analysts often point to this concept called carbon lock-in to explain why it's so difficult to switch, from brown technologies to green. So, to give you a sense of that concept, if a country builds a bit of brown energy infrastructure, let's say a coal plant, there's a lot of physical infrastructure that goes around that. As well as social infrastructure, so roads, ports, supply chains, regulations, community expectations about energy price, and all of these systems kind of work together to create the kind of lock-in effect, which makes it very difficult to change from different technology, from brown to green. And if we look back historically, what we see is one of the most dramatic ways of breaking carbon lock-in is through major geopolitical and economic shocks. So we can look back at the Great Depression, World War II, the oil crises in the 70s, and these all precipitated big changes. And that's particularly true with respect to energy technology. The example that often people raise is the shift to nuclear power, for example, after the oil crisis in the 70s. So I think it's an important point, and because there is a big opportunity here, COVID, for all of its devastation, devastating human impact, there is a from a dry economic perspective, there is a opportunity for a shift to happen. And I think, if, the previous speakers have hinted at this point that some of the efforts to date, they've certainly been mixed. They've probably not been taking advantage, I think, of this moment as much as they could. So if we look just at sort of fiscal stimulus measures, the picture is pretty clear. Unfortunately, that governments have not embraced this window of opportunity. So let's just look at the sort of the largest 20 economies, the G20. They've spent $12 trillion-ish on stimulus so far. About 4 trillion of that has gone to sectors which could have major impacts on climate change: agriculture, industry, the energy transport sectors. And the most recent kind of analysis of that, there are many sources of this, but by and large points to the fact that the majority of those G20 countries are still investing that stimulus in areas in a way that will have a net negative impact on emissions. So in other words, it won't help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, this is particularly bad amongst Asian economies. So Indonesia, India, Japan are a few examples where corporate bailouts have been offered with no green strings attached, where there's been regulatory and financial support for industries which we know are environmentally damaging. There are some shining examples. I think Meriden mentioned South Korea, for example. They spent $52 billion in green finance to support hydrogen vehicles, renewable energy over the next 5 years. But I guess the main point is there's plenty of room for improvement within the region to kind of capture the full potential of this crisis.
Thanks very much, Arjuna. Some really interesting insights there, and I want to kind of build on that, as well as the comment from Mutsaharul earlier, and I'll come back to you now, Mutsaharul, just on, you know, as we look to governance, as you would be very aware, you know, it's often referred to as the fourth pillar of sustainable development, and you know, the UN and others really look to their member states to integrate the goals into their national sustainability, into their development plans. And the UN system also obviously encourage, which we've seen here in Australia as well, to for its member states to conduct so-called voluntary national reviews to report on their progress against the SDGs. So what is your assessment? You mentioned, you know, not all the indicators are available or reported on. You know, what is your assessment of progress in Asia in terms of, again, the policy making and the policy implementation that needs to be in place to really support the 2030 agenda, to be able to report on the indicators, but also make sure that those indicators are, you know, front of mind for governments as we come now in the you know, the last decade coming up to the 2030 agenda. Not a small question, but keen to hear an observation from you sitting at the UN. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Thomas. Again, as I have mentioned already, that if we look into the SDG progress, we are lagging behind, and this is the decade is going to be very important to scale up the action. Now, one of the additional things that I'd like to mention as a part of integrating this policy in the implementation, if we look into the area that I'm working, which is climate change, so I'll be mainly focusing on the climate change, both in the context of the mitigation as well as the adaptation. If we look into the Asia Pacific, all countries, they have submitted their nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, and the number of countries are also working on updating their NDC, which is an important the tools for the country to actually demonstrate how they're integrating one of the key environmental dimension into the policy making and the implementation. If we look into the overall, the recognition is there, but the challenge is raising the ambition and implementing the action. Now, let me just give a bit of a focus on the raising the ambition. And without the raising the ambition under the Paris Agreement, the temperature is going to go even more than 3 degrees. And the impact that we are seeing right now arising from this pandemic, the impact of the climate change of the 3 degree is going to be much, much higher and the worst. Now, if we look into the current status of this raising the ambition, and I'm just referring the NDC tracker, which is saying that the 33 countries have stated their intention to update the NDC by the 2020. And if we look into all those 33 countries, it's representing only 8.3% of the global emission. Another 103 countries, they have stated their intention to raise the ambition by the 2020, and those 103 countries represent around 40% of the global emission. Another, if we look into the current status, the 14 countries have submitted their updated the NDC, and representing only around 4% of the global emission. So if we combine all those countries who has expressed their intention, it's less than 50% of the global emission that we are talking about. So it is nowhere closer to the 1.5 degree, which is the aspiration of the Paris Agreement, but keeping the temperature below 2 degrees. We are nowhere closer to that target. We have heard that the Japan has mentioned, the new Prime Minister mentioned that Japan will become the carbon neutral by the 2050. But if we look into the updated NDC that they have submitted, it is not ambitious. The Vietnam, they have also submitted their updated NDCs. They have raised their ambition. But as I mentioned, that if we look into the 5 countries in this region who have submitted their updated NDC, it is nowhere closer to the reduction level that we need to keep the temperature below 2 degrees, or even the aspirational target is a 1.5 degree. And if I'm not mistaken, even the Australian government, I think it was in sometime in May or June, that the Minister for the Energy and the Emission Reduction mentioned that they are going to simply communicate or recommunicate it's the NDC for the COP26. I do not know whether there is any change happen after that, the announcement. So recognition is there, but that recognition is not translating into the real action in terms of the climate change, and which is important to keep the overall sustainability of the economy, society, and the environment. So let me stop, and I'll be happy to talk about the adaptation aspect if time permits later on. But I'd like to focus on the mitigation, because this is very important in terms of environmental sustainability and functioning the economic sector without the major impacts of climate change.
No, that's really interesting to hear, and I think some really important points. And we're going to come also briefly to the Australian situation and kind of look a little bit closer what's happening here. But I wanted now to turn to both Meredith and Arjuna, just looking at your essays for Disruptive Asia and unpack some of the points you made there, again on the role of initially with Meriden on the multilateral system, staying with that for now, and in your essay ASEAN's way to sustainable development, you argue that the member countries there really need to integrate a much greater sense of common environmental destiny to the already existing diplomatic and economic relations and processes. You know, we always look to ASEAN and look at the potential for action. And again, you know, on Motsaharo's point, the ambition might be there, but the action may not. So, you know, what is your assessment? You know, how likely is it to happen that we can see more, you know, policy implementation from ASEAN as a grouping? And can we expect more regional and indeed global leadership from this grouping when it comes to the 2030 agenda?
Thanks. As I mentioned before, I think it's really important to remember the kind of overarching geopolitical context here, because that plays a role in what we're seeing. And this instinct for cooperation, multilateral cooperation, is eroding all around the world. It was already happening before COVID, and COVID is exacerbating that tendency. And we're seeing leaders turning inwards. The instinct is to protect yourselves. We're not thinking about, you know, cooperating for the greater global good. We're worried about self-protection, and that's true in Asia, and that's true for ASEAN countries as well, I would argue. And so, as I say in the essay, when ASEAN was founded, it was founded by member states who were looking to cooperate with each other on the foundation of being sovereign states in order to promote national benefits and national level interests. So it was a means to protect national sovereignty and national interests. It was no way a means to pool sovereignty or to blur those lines of sovereignty. And that's very clear in the articulation of the ASEAN principles, in which sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference are absolutely key principles. Now, those principles were the founding principles, and they still hold very strong, and they've underpinned a long period of stability, security, and prosperity for ASEAN countries in the Asian region. And I can't see in the near or even medium-term future a moment where ASEAN leaders all agree to set aside those principles. I think it's highly politically unlikely. So then I wonder if it's possible for ASEAN countries, instead of putting aside those principles altogether, but to think about taking an issues-based approach. And I think this is something we're going to see more of in general in the future of diplomacy and addressing these issues. So perhaps they could work together on particular cross-border issues. And one example that comes to mind for me is thinking about the Mekong River and access to water from the Mekong River. Now, this is becoming an increasingly challenging issue for many ASEAN countries. That river that starts off in China is responsible for the livelihoods of over 70 million people across particularly 5 ASEAN countries: Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. But climate change and the incredible number of dams, something around 400 dams on that river, built for hydropower, are pushing water levels. They've hit record lows for 2 years in a row now. You know, when it's supposed to be high flood season, it's a sort of a sad little trickle. And, you know, people rely on this for agriculture, for farming, for fishing, and they're just not able to access what they need from this river anymore. So if these countries can't cooperate and don't cooperate, the likelihood is that these livelihoods are going to be destroyed, and people aren't going to sort of sit by and let that happen. So we're going to see social unrest, we're going to see mass migration, refugees within countries and possibly cross borders as well, political instability, intra-country tension, cross-country tension, and conflict. You know, we're talking about some really big and critical challenges coming out of this. So I wonder if it's this kind of very real crisis that might, on an issues basis, motivate these countries to take a broader, more shared perspective on dealing with cross-border issues.
I think that's a very fascinating insight, and be interesting to see how that might you know, pan out 2021 as well, as we look to the region for some big summits on the sustainability front. I wanted to also, you know, look at Australia briefly as well before we come to some of our audience questions, which are coming in. Thank you very much, and encourage everyone to pose a question if you have one to our panelists. But Arjuna, want to come to you, and you know, looking at Australia and the Australian government, but also with respect to their collaboration in Asia. But we know that earlier this year, the government here released the technology investment roadmap, which, and I quote, will bring a strategic and system-wide view to future investments in low emissions technologies. In February, we saw the King Review outline ways in which Australia can lower its emissions while also supporting the economy. What's your take on these kind of recent policy initiatives? Is it a step in the right direction? Do they go far enough in your view? Or what else should now happen as we, you know, slowly coming out of the worst of the pandemic here in Australia?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I mean, I think you know, when public policy analysts, you know, review policies, they often say, "Oh, the devil is in the detail." But I think with respect to the technology investment roadmap, the opposite might be true. So, which is to say that I think the devil here might actually be in the broader context rather than the detail itself. So I guess my view of the roadmap is that in isolation, it sends some very important signals for you know, how Australia might respond in the context of a carbon-constrained economy. And there's some important signals in there, and you know, commitments for financial support for research and development in the short to medium term. You know, the document, for instance, points towards support for the development of renewable energy-based export markets by supporting energy storage and hydrogen technologies, for example. And I think that's a good thing. But my my take on the kind of document and the policy settings is that what's lacking here is the broader context. So how does the government incentivize the uptake of technology to which they're committing this R&D funding? How aggressively will the government encourage technology switching, and how will it do so in an orderly manner? So you can think about, one of the technologies, for instance, that's called out in the roadmap, carbon capture and storage. To implement CCS, if you're a company, it requires, upfront capital investments to purchase the required technology. It'll require ongoing operating costs to ensure that that technology is in place. And, business people who run companies will probably ask, well, why would we take up such technology in the absence of some kind of regulatory requirement or a price signal to do so? And at the moment, in the absence of an economy-wide price on carbon or a regulatory signal in place, it's hard to see how a technology like the one like CCS, which is called out in this roadmap, might diffuse across the economy writ large, and therefore, lead to emission reductions. There are other things I could say about this. Technology switching obviously involves a lot of social and political questions. In this country in particular, we've got a large mining and resource sector, and changes in that sector will inevitably require consideration of what those impacts will have on livelihoods and communities. At the moment, those things are inherently tied together with technology change, and at the moment, it's hard to see where the government stands on those issues, and therefore, in the absence of policy positions there, to my mind, it's hard to see how the roadmap really goes far enough.
Thanks, Arjun. I think we've heard similar observations made before, but it's really interesting to hear your take as well. And just very briefly, I wanted to come to your essay as well, and then we'll go to a few audience questions. But you wrote a really interesting piece on state-owned enterprises, which is also part of your broader research at Stanford, and how SOEs contribute and respond to climate change. And I guess the argument you're making is that it can really impact also life here in Australia, maybe in more ways than we currently are aware. Very briefly, what's behind your assessment, and what impact do you see SOEs can really play with regards to the SDGs? Yeah,
sure. Thank you. I'm at risk here. As you said, it's a topic for which I'm currently kind of in the throes of doing some research. So let me try and keep my comments really brief and instead refer people to the essay, which is online, where some of this material is covered in more detail. But the central point really is that state-owned enterprises are very important to climate change, but often neglected. Anyone who's been following the news in Australia this week will know that state-owned enterprises still exist. Australia Post is in the press for all the wrong reasons. But my point in my essay is that these firms have a big impact on climate change. Primarily, that's because they are still very prevalent in the energy sector. So if we think about electricity, 62% of global electricity is produced by state-owned enterprises. And so, their role in the global kind of decarbonization process is very important, but often it's bundled up together with considerations of all firms. So, so policy makers, institutional investors, activists, and others often think about, decarbonization in the electricity sector as if all firms are the same and that they will all respond in the same way. So you see these prevalent kind of policy positions prioritizing carbon pricing, for example, or disclosure of climate risks. And I guess what I'm sort of arguing in the essay is, and doing further work on, is to think about what are some of the other mechanisms which are important with respect to SOEs. What are the things that they respond to, and how might we better engage SOEs to make those transitions so that we're focusing on this important group of companies. With respect to your second point, I think, which was about how does this matter for Australians, I think the easiest thing to do, or the easiest way to make that point, is to point to, I guess, an incident that happened a couple of weeks ago, which was a sort of dramatic change amongst Chinese SOEs in accepting Australian coal. So there was a ban imposed, which had pretty significant implications for the coal price in the short term. The reason, why that change was able to happen so quickly was because it was instituted by, by Chinese state-owned companies, which are responsive, or much more quickly responsive to, centralized government demands. And so I guess my point here is that as countries, important countries to Australia, like China, change their policy positions, make attempts to decarbonize and so on, there will be big implications for Australian industry and for the communities that are affected by those changes. So I've probably gone on too long already, but like I said, I encourage you to have a look at the essay if you're interested in this topic.
Great, thank you, Arjun. I encourage the same. It's a really interesting piece. But I wanted us to, I know we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to bring in one question as well from our audience, and I might put this to Merit, and it was something we talked briefly about yesterday as well, but just drawing on your expertise on China as well. A question that's come through is, we talked about China's commitment and pledge to peak carbon by 2030. They're trying to drive down emissions. We're also on the cusp of the 14th five-year plan. Is this really an opportunity for China to commit to pledges such as cutting emissions? Do you see that likely to happen, and how do you think this will feature in the next five-year plan?
Thanks, it's a great question. China watchers around the world are very excited about the five-year plan coming up. Likely to see some actual information about that maybe March next year. At the moment, we're all still reading tea leaves and hypothesizing, but certainly this is hugely on the agenda. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this is driven by a growing expectation among the population of China that the government does something about it. Quality of life is a pillar of legitimacy for the Chinese authorities. What's interesting is these announcements about 2030, 2060. President Xi Jinping has made these announcements, and when they're associated with the president in that way, it's not a sort of offhand remark. It's going to be something that the president's success will be judged on, and the president must be successful. So I think that we have a real kind of conundrum here. On one hand, China is an enormous emitter; it's an enormous investor in coal. It's still investing in coal. But on the other hand, we have these kind of really big commitments. But what we do know is that the political weight is behind those commitments. And once you've got President Xi Jinping behind them, people further down will follow. So I think there's reason for not unbridled optimism, but genuinely being pretty excited about those announcements.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're really going to be looking closely at that come next year. It's going to be really interesting to follow. And I think, unfortunately, we are out of time, and I think that's an interesting point to finish off on as we look ahead. And it might be an opportunity also for our broader bilateral relationship to really focus in on a key issue. And as you say, Meredith, to take an issues-based approach with China around sustainability might also be the benefit for the Australian government. It's an important issue, and where we really can collaborate. So I want to like to end it there, but thank you very much for your insights. It's a really rich discussion again, and 45 minutes never gives it justice, and we could really go on deeper on some of those issues. But thanks for your expertise and for sharing your insights, and also to Krista Milne, who joined us earlier but had to go back to the pressing work at the City Council in Melbourne, but very pleased to have them joining us as a co-host and partner today. And obviously to all of you at home or in your offices viewing online, thank you very much for joining us today. I also wanted to remind you, all our essays are online, including from Meriden and Arjuna. If you want to go deeper on some of these topics, please do head to our website, where you can find all the essays in the Sustainability Special Edition of Disruptive Asia. Before we go, also just a mention that our Disruptive Asia webinar series will come to a grand finale and conclusion next month. On the 26th of November, we will officially launch the special Sustainability Edition of Disruptive Asia, Volume 4, 2020, and in partnership with our major sponsor, WWF Australia, our knowledge partner, the University of Queensland, and also with the ongoing support of the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas. We'll be hosting an event with Dr. Bambang Susantono, the Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development at the Asian Development Bank, and also Pawan Sukhdev, International President of Worldwide Fund for Nature. Also joining us is the award-winning journalist Desi Anwar, who's a senior anchor and director at CNN Indonesia, who will moderate the conversation. I will have the opportunity to just sit back and enjoy. So really looking forward to that. I hope you all can join us then. Until then, stay well and keep safe, and bye for now.